Hi, I'm Scott Barry Kaufman from the Imagination Institute. At the Imagination Institute, we're dedicated to making progress on the growth, improvement, and measurement of imagination across all sectors of society. Toward that aim, we've been hosting a series of imagination retreats. These retreats consist of discussions with some of the world's most imaginative thinkers across a wide range of fields, from psychology to comedy to physics to spirituality, among others. We've had a lot of exciting discussions about how imagination operates within each field and how it can help young people develop imagination. We've also been discussing the importance of imagination in society more generally. What you're about to watch is edited footage of one of these imagination retreats. In addition, all the videos and reports of all the retreats will be available on our website at imagination-institute.org. What is the default mode network anyway? Now, in my reading of the literature, I see lots of different attempts at categorizing this very broad network where there are clearly these various components to the network. I've seen self-generated cognition amongst this group, you two, high preponderance, this idea of and I've seen spontaneous thought. I've seen self-generate cognition. Marty and I use the phrase, we call it the imagination network, because if you just simply define imagination as your ability to attend to things that aren't immediately present to your senses, if you have as broad a definition of imagination as that, it seems like all of the functions of the imagination network relate to that in some way. So I've seen all these various things. Is there something that you guys think unites it? And is it even worth discussing at United, or maybe it makes more sense to just simply refer to the subsystems? Maybe that's a better level. So I want to open up that discussion.
For me, they're actually all different things. And they're all super interesting, but they're different in terms of, I haven't used as much self-generated. I think Jess has at times favored that term. I used self-generated ways back when I was trying to analyze executive reasoning, actually. I used self-generated information because that seemed to be like a high-level ability for people to work with self-generated thought at a second order of complexity. But actually, after I used that term, I realized how problematic it was theoretically, because it was pointed out to me by people from vision and attention that actually everything is self-generated. Like even the percept of a car moving on the street is self-generated because your system generates the motion. You don't actually see motion. So I think as a term is not specific enough. Although when if you define it differently, then it becomes it can become specific. So for me, self-generated is one thing, and it could mean actually a lot of things. And then spontaneous is the one that I favored over the years. Partly, I zeroed in on that because I was looking for a positive way of referring to what I'm interested in. And all the ways at the time were negative.
I think what we call the default network is heuristically this large collection of distributed circuits that, for lack of a better word, is really good at constructing things that are not in the here and now. They might connect with these other things, and this leads to both, at least my view on what is the default network. I mean, it's not a single network, probably. It's a number of distributed association circuits that are used when you detach from the outside world. So we captured them experimentally when you had people lie in a scanner and we didn't give them something to do. But it's driven by a lot of goal-directed behaviors. When you think about something you're going to do later, when you have to construct from memory and detach from the sensory world, these are the circuits that are being used. I think they are anatomically connected circuits. They're distributed. Pat Goldman-Rakish has a beautiful paper in '87 where she outlines these things anatomically. People have talked about these in terms of neurological syndromes. Marcel Meslam has talked about this extensively. And in the tool that my laboratory happened to use, we captured it when we had people lie down and do nothing, and now can show it has a lot of different uses. So I think it's a physical network or series of networks of association cortex that have been specialized through evolution to be very flexible and constructive and allow you to do all sorts of interesting processes. And in humans, they're highly related to social functions. They tend to be embodied in many different ways because that's probably the circuitry it's built upon.
So there are lots of ways in which people have streams of thought that are internally directed, not externally focused, often cued by themselves. Maybe sometimes there's some task-related stimulus that gets it going, but that's not an essential part of it. So it does seem that even though terms like internally directed mentation or stimulus-independent thought or decoupled thought, they get a lot of what the default network does. But these counterexamples should give us pause. And I'm just going to reiterate what Kalina and Jessica said in their Nature Neuroscience review. This dynamic perspective that really looks at deliberative, intentional, goal-directed streams of thought versus spontaneous, discursive streams of thought. It's not ideal, and there's probably some counterexamples to that, but that probably has the best chance at picking out what the default network does and what it doesn't do.
Two of the most interesting functions that I think people have ascribed to the default network are very much at odds with each other. And one of them is, these are not exhaustive, two of them. One of them is this idea that it allows us to do this kind of rich simulation of things that are not in our current environment. It allows us to vividly remember the past and kind of be there and have the experience surround us, or imagine hypothetical scenarios and create this rich experience in our minds that we're not currently having. And to me, that feels like the data that the mind is working over there is very concrete, and it has detail and features. And then at the other end of the spectrum is the function of the default network that we see come up in tasks that require you to abstract away from the details that people are seeing. So even just in myodona, if you contrast looking at abstract stimuli versus concrete stimuli, you get the kind of more dorsal subnetwork of the default network. Same set of regions come up in language, which is a huge abstraction process. If you look at, Uri Hassan's work, people who are listening to stories over long time scales and extracting the meaning from the story, these are the regions that come up. And so I don't know how to square these two very different functions. I have some ideas, but they're not ready to be verbalized yet. But I think just for this reason that these two functions seem to be very much at opposite ends of the spectrum, you have to do some splitting before you can put all of these things into the same network.
My thought on a lot of the things that were said was that this is actually a really good example for me in a moment that makes me realize that the lumping together of default mode network is where now the field is being held back by this concept that we have, which really helped us in the last decade, and now it's holding us back because it's lumping together things that are not the same. So, and the two of you have been hugely influential in separating the default into three different components, which are clearly so different and map onto a lot of the things that you're discussing. And I think now the field is at a moment where it's ready to, be done with it. Hopefully one day we wake up and we realize that and we move on and we start thinking of these subcomponents as separable and differentially integrated or integratable to the other components that we know about. And this is what we were trying to do in our paper.
What I'm advocate for is kind of a lot of marginalized cognitive processes that some researchers may put a global label such as boring on, but which are actually quite interesting to a certain segment of the population. Individual differences, I feel like, get ignored a lot in this kind of research. What's maybe boring to one person might be extraordinarily interesting to someone else.
For some of these domains that have become the topic at our conference here, our discussions here, I don't know if it was about boredom as much as there are a lot of topics that are taboo. When I became involved in this arena, it was a bit taboo, and I was probably one of the people who at first didn't think it was something that could be studied, but by the time we started to work on it, there was already enough of a receptive community to sort of be reinforcing. And so I think taboo is an important concept.
Recreate that some more. So what did things look like when you started, and how taboo was it?
I'll tell you what I think the critical feature of the default network is that caused it to persist and now be studied as an important scientific topic. In the early days, you were getting glimpses of these networks that were used when people, we now think mind wandering might be the correlate to some degree, but you were getting glimpses of this network simply because they were the control conditions of other experiments. Everybody was doing studies that would capture these networks serendipitously, but the discussion of these findings in the network do not appear in the early papers. And at the time, in the early days of the field, the focus was not on what are the networks doing when people are at rest in a scanner. The entire focus on a technical point was how do you design studies to make good contrast to be able to interpret that thing which you're interested in, memory, language, and attention. And the focus on these reference conditions, these rest conditions, was on whether they're appropriate or not. And I think the entire first set of debates that I witnessed and were involved in, or discussions at meetings, were about that technical point. I don't want to speak to everybody, we dismissed this as uninteresting. And if I think back to this, it probably challenged the way we were doing studies. We were having people do a memory study, and we were comparing it to a reference task. And if the reference task was an active task doing lots of things, it was a problem, undermined your study. And so I try to think not of how I contributed to this field, but it's interesting for me to think about all the times I missed the opportunity to contribute. When we first learned about these things and saw these things, I personally didn't think they're interesting. I've been documented that. I have an interesting documentation. I'm one of the first to actually describe anatomically have maps of the entire default network. But if you read the text in early papers in 1995 and 96, we either didn't pay any attention to it or actually dismissed it because it was found during rest. The only reason I would say I reported was no insight. It was just a compulsive tendency to describe everything we got in the study. There was no insight that it would be important. But the interesting thing to me is there was other people around who did see the importance of it. And Nancy Andreasen was one of these people who wrote a beautiful paper in 1995 about this network, its presence during rest, and how it relates to mind-wandering spontaneous thought. From start to finish, from the anatomy to the current ideas, she captured a lot of this in 1995. She had written letters to Mark Rakel and myself talking about how, in some sense, it was unfortunate that we were using these conditions of reference because they involved all this spontaneous thought and memory. And I talked to her about this. And if I recall correctly, I still didn't get it at all. I just dismissed this and set it aside. It wasn't until many years later where I started to think deeply about what she's saying. So to me, it's also interesting about the start of this field, how it was so easy to miss what was obvious.
Why does neuroscience legitimize other topics? There's no objective reason why neuroscience is more legitimate than really well done behavioral work. There's no objective reason. Why do we buy into that, though? That you see that in the media, and I don't think it's the neuroscientists' fault, but you see it a lot with the media. It's like, as long as you say the neuroscience of X, then everyone's like, oh, we'll take it seriously now. Why?
But why does Tom Insel only fund neuroscience and doesn't fund social psychology anymore? It's all part of a kind of a worship of neuroscience.
There
and
is
we
a
have
worship. The seductive allure of neuroscience is my advisor.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of whether it's seductive or whether there could be parts of that are legitimate, that endless armchair speculation won't ever be progressive, whereas when neuroscience grabs a hold of it, you now have a way of making the study systematic. There's probably a little bit of both.
I think there's two sides of it. One of it is the allure of neuroscience for the public, and public acceptance is obviously important and huge. But I think also for the neuroscientists, it's like a slap in the face by the data, because the neuroscientists didn't get there like easily, evolutionary, and willingly. Like we were slapped by the face by the neuroscience data, right? Like I was with my own data, and so then you realize it's not just the popular effect; it also has it is something about that data that didn't happen to psychologists. Like they didn't. So something within psychology was not strong enough to do that to psychologists, but it was strong enough to do that to us as neuroscientists, to like make us do an about face in terms of what we value as experimental paradigms as a field.
This is a great point. The prioritization is probably in this case healthily driven up in a bottom-up way by the data. This is the biggest effect you see when you put a human being in the scanner.
The fact that you have a picture that is in front of you and people can see it and say, that is a brain, a real brain, you can't ignore that, right? But if you ask a person what they're thinking, you can chalk up their answer to, well, they don't really know what they're thinking, or they're crazy, or, you know, this is the time of Freud. So you can't ignore a picture.
You can have a lot of armchair philosophers say stuff about how they think. And hindsight is 20/20 when you later find other types of evidence for it. So you can go back and find these amazing quotes about people who have predicted the default network. But until you find the default network, you know, any of the set of possibilities of all these thinkers could be true. And so I don't think the evidence has to come from neuroscience, but I think any idea is going to be more compelling when you have convergent evidence from multiple sources. Neuroscience just happens to be a type of evidence that works at a completely different level than philosophical thought or than behavioral measures. And so when you can get two completely different types of evidence for the same idea, then you have a lot of grounding in saying that this idea is probably something that is cutting nature at its joints. And so it's just, I think, it doesn't have to be neuroscience. It could be anything that comes at the same idea from a totally different angle and comes to the same conclusion.
Neuroscience is directly empirical, whereas maybe social science, like really well-designed social science studies, are kind of a step removed, you could say, maybe because it's more phenomenological, and then it's more the philosophers and like the hardcore theoreticians who are trying to talk about a priori structures of the mind. And so when you have all of those the arguments that wed with the data, then you really have like a robust model that has kind of an integrated perspective from different fields.
I mean, I think this is a brilliant point. It makes the invisible visible in a way that you couldn't see this before. And that's especially important here because, especially in terms of systems neuroscience, but even a lot of orientations in cognitive psychology, the readout is behavior, where you make manipulations and changes in behavior, whether it's accuracy or response times, or in systems neuroscience where you're presenting visual stimuli or auditory stimuli, the animal's making a response, you're trying to track the intervening steps that get you from the input to the output. Now here we go into this taboo arena where the topic is spontaneous thoughts, almost arguably independent of their behavioral readout. It's just simply inaccessible. I think everybody would agree you do it a lot of the time, but it's inaccessible in a way that even if people agree that it's there, they might disagree on whether you can study it or not. The neuroscience, the biological readouts, if nothing else, make that invisible visible when it's happening. And so I think that's a very important, maybe special contribution here of neuroscience. And let me put this in another context. I think the field of mental illness has been so stigmatized and not fit into the normal medical model, which has tremendous consequences. When somebody is suffering from mental illness, they suffer twice. They suffer from the illness itself, and they suffer the stigma in society. In fact, people tremendously underestimate the prevalence of mental illness because people don't talk about it. There's a place where even if the biological understanding hasn't led to specific treatments, a place where I think neuroimaging has contributed tremendously by simply showing that these illnesses are biological disorders of the brain. I think genetics does this as well. But even that hasn't been translated yet or fueled therapeutic targets or efficiencies in clinical trials or biomarkers that a physician can use. The demonstration that specific systems in the brain are changed and different in individuals suffering from depression, I think is tremendous value for destigmatizing and bringing back some of these illnesses into, where I think they belong, into the typical medical model. And so maybe in retrospect, people go, of course, in 5 years, of course these things are in the brain. But at the time, I can tell you whether some people were saying that, this wasn't permeating the culture, and destigmatization in the field of mental illness has been a tremendous contribution, I think, of imaging and genetics.
There's I think, a potentially very toxic popular misconception of the function of meditation in its various guises, which is that the point is to quiet your mind. One of the, I can't remember, I used to have the phonemes, but one of the Tibetan words for meditation is familiarization. The point is to become more intimate with your mind, not to escape it, which I think is just, it's a very different framing, and I think a more compassionate one than having like a kind of violent trying to get rid of the mental phenomena. It's more changing the relationship to it.
I don't know that much about meditation, but I read a little bit about the different types, and especially by the neuroscientists. So filtered through the neuroscientists, they make the distinction between focused meditation versus open monitoring. So is that not the distinction being made here? So Kabat-Zinn sounds like he's emphasizing focused meditation, which would presumably reduce the default network, whereas you guys both seem to be emphasizing open monitoring. And that makes sense. It doesn't sound like that would tamp down the default network, but would in fact change your relationship to it.
Yeah, but even focused meditation, it's not about inhibiting the thinking. It's still about being mindful of when your mind has wandered and then returning to the breath, not getting rid of the mind wandering. But you're mindful to the extent to which you're mindful that your mind is wandering.
Wouldn't you curtail trains of spontaneous thought if you have a focus of attention that is returning to your breath?
Yes, and that's why research does show that so focused meditation is negatively correlated with divergent thinking, whereas open monitoring meditation is positively correlated. So the latest meta-analysis on the link between meditation and creativity shows that focused meditation is negatively correlated. It's positively correlated with convergent thinking, and then you see the reverse. So that's absolutely the case.
Drake, and one of the things, actually, it's just fascinating to hear the way you described meditation. It reminds me, and I wonder if there's an analog, one of the best pieces of advice I had when we first had our first child that somebody said is, like something you were saying is, your goal is not to stop your kid from crying. Your goal is to comfort your child, your baby, when they're crying. And any new parent knows this. It depends on the kid, but my kid was not going to stop crying. He needed to cry, and after a little while, you realize, in this particular kid, if he cried, he was going to sleep for a long time. Like, this is just what he does. There's nothing wrong, and you're just comforting the child, as opposed to the first 2 months of his existence. As a parent, you're just terribly stressed out. What am I doing wrong? I can't get the kid to stop crying. Literally, like a switch. Somebody said, don't think of it that way. Just think your goal is to comfort your child while he cries, as he will cry. And totally took the stress away from that bedtime routine of an hour where he cried for an hour. You just bounced him around, and he slept like, literally a baby for as long as you're going to sleep. And here, when listening to you talk about these things, is a really interesting analogy, because it's not the same, but it is similar in the sense that as a meta-aware, maybe the only meta-aware, metacognitive species, we are keenly aware of all our thoughts and judge them all the time. I shouldn't be doing this. I shouldn't be, whether it be about efficiency or just simply not wanting to have them. But is part of it that people are just meant to become comfortable with their presence and in some sense accept their presence as opposed to try to change them?
Again, Thich Nhat Hanh says it's having a nonviolent relationship with your mind.
Drake, this makes a lot of sense, and it does suggest that mindfulness is not the opposite of mind wandering. And I think that needs to be a point that I want to make over and over again to people who tend to misrepresent this, treat them as opposites of each other.
This is what a lot of the theories are suggesting, is that creativity is the dynamic oscillation between two very different states of what I think would be described as highly unconstrained and then highly constrained. And this is how people that come up with, visual artists whose job is to come up with creative products every day, oftentimes train themselves that way and describe this alteration between really crazy generative mode of like brainstorming way when they do all kinds of tricks to trick their mind to generate crazy ideas, and then switching to this very highly constrained evaluative mode where they weed out the bad ones, and then going back to the crazy unconstrained one, is that dynamic oscillation is what then creates the product.
It does raise the question of, when we're talking about what makes some people creative or what are effective, modes for the creative process, I suddenly don't know what people do during their day. And I mean that at a molecular level. Like if we had cameras or devices or tracked, how often do people sit and work and get up and walk around and come back? Do those patterns actually predict whether some people are more creative or less creative?
There's a literature on computer typing in which you can look at the interval between pressing keys. In general, you find before a comma there's a longer interval, and after a period there's an even longer interval. So one could extend that to pauses and for at least for when you're composing something on a computer.
And it's one thing to say an individual's creative, but to think of this as an output. There are people who come up with novel things that many would say, well, that's creative. And it's interesting that we then attribute this to some trait in an individual. What if there's many different routes? I mean, completely different styles that lead to people being generative in that way.
My own tendency tends to be towards the more depressive phase. Like I tend to get stuck in there. And so what I've noticed in myself, that I really benefit from collaborating with people who have the opposite tendency, which people often identify as ADHD. So I've had, someone like Zach Irving, who is a self-identified ADHD person. For some reason, I really work well with him. And I think what happens is, I make myself more creative by putting myself in his presence, because I don't get stuck in that overly constrained mode. Or after I do, I have a way of getting out of there. And that, I think, has really interesting
He generates and you
connections.
test.
He's always like moving on to the next thing, and I always tend to stay on to one thing. Well, I don't always, but I have a tendency. And so I think it's interesting to, first of all, try to look for people who can both get into these extreme states and get out of them. And I think that essentially is going to predispose them to mental instability, right? And so, that's a whole different field there. But then I think it's interesting to look at how people achieve that in terms of product and actually try to account for their collaborations.
I think there's a confusion in the field about what the word mind wandering really means. I personally use it in very different. I use it as a good thing, like related to daydreaming. When I think of mind wandering, I always, almost use it like, well, it's. But then I start to think maybe we should differentiate mind wandering from daydreaming, because the field is tending to use mind wandering. There's a certain faction of the field that uses mind wandering in a negative light, or in the light they define it as when you're trying to focus on a task, it's the thoughts that are taking you away from high performance on that task. So people like Michael Caine would tend to use the term mind wandering in that sense. So if you're doing a reading comprehension task, if you're trying to drive a car, you really want to focus. He would say the mind wandering is everything that is taking you away from what you actually really want to focus on. But then there's other researchers, Quina, others that take a more neutral, I think, in my reading of your work, a more neutral way of interpreting the term mind wandering, that it can be good or bad, but it really is part of the spontaneous cognition system. What are some other ways people specifically define that? And then we can start to discuss how that might contribute to creativity.
There's actually two ways in which wander is being used in common language. One is, my mind just wandered off. People say that, right? So like I was driving and my mind wandered off. So that's a momentary act. And the term mind wandering implies a continuous mental state. So confusing these together, which essentially that field implicitly does, is actually deeply problematic in many levels. So calling mind wandering the act of the mind going off a task is just wrong. And actually the difference came to me really clear in a real life example. It doesn't come to us very often as scientists, but the lawyer of this woman from Hawaii who was being sued by the state for running into a bunch of cars wrote to me, and he described that what happened in her case was she was driving home to get lunch, and it happened to be the anniversary of the first anniversary of her husband's death. So she takes off from her office and goes home to get lunch. And as she's doing that, she runs into a pile of cars stopped at a red light. And so the state was actually bringing up a lawsuit against her, essentially for negligent driving. And the idea was that a reasonable person should be able to control their mind. And so the way it was formulated is that her lawyer wrote this brilliant, very eloquently worded letter. He said she wasn't texting, she wasn't fussing, she wasn't doing anything unreasonable. Her mind just wandered off, right? And this is crucial because her mind wandered. It was not wandering. And actually, so my analysis of the situation, not being her, which is obviously going to be necessarily speculative, is she was in a state, so there's something called the anniversary effect, which people who have gone through some traumatic event re-experience that spontaneously on the anniversary of that, whether or not they're actually aware that they're doing that. So my analysis of what was happening in her case is that it wandered off, but then it was not wandering. It was not free to move to various places. It actually it became captive to these re-experiencing emotional, whatever was happening in her mind. It was so captive that it was not free to move back to the road when there was an importance of moving that. So that's a really good real-life example where the difference between my mind wandered off and my mind was wandering makes potentially a life or death difference, right?
How does mind wandering inform, you get to the process, there's a moment of epiphany or a moment of insight. Like, what is there a neuroscientific account of how mind wandering tracks to epiphany?
Yeah, one of the interesting findings that they have put out there is that they use EEG for vast majority of their studies, and they found that milliseconds prior to insight, they found what they called as a shutdown or a brain blink of occipital cortex, which they were interpreting as shutdown of sensory input to converge on this inner connection, and then that leads to the aha moment.
A natural conclusion is that spontaneous thought feeds into implicit learning systems in an ongoing way, and in an inarticulable way, you're forming generalizations and insights. And at some point, it just kind of pops out. So the epiphany feels like it's a momentary experience, but it's built on top of tons and tons of brute force, replaying experience, doing various forms of implicit learning. So what feels momentary is actually built on top of a very long, extended subterranean stream of activity.
Does anyone else have thoughts on what interventions maybe you would recommend if you were improving creativity? What would you target? Which systems would you target? Motivational systems, not just cognitive systems?
If there are innate tendencies toward creativity, and kids are exploratory, and whether it be at their grandparents' farm or just naturally so, what do we need to do to allow it to persist? In the modern world where things are so structured and children spend large amounts of time in constrained settings to acquire extraordinary volumes of domain-specific knowledge and also skills like reading, we've clamped down on exploratory behavior. I think there's attempts to put it back, but I guess the first question would be is, how do we not crush it?
And the threats are not just the places in our society where we impose structure, but when I was going to college, I sat in the bus, and there's 15, 20 minutes of where there's nothing to do other than be lost in your own thoughts. the places in our society, that same bus ride, college kids at UT Austin are getting on that bus ride, every single one of them has their phone. And so even the places that don't have structure, there are threats. So it's the structure that produces threats and the fact that there are infinite distractions that in the unstructured time that also produces threats.
But Maury, you had a different view on this, didn't you? That you thought kids, they're inherent, you didn't think they were inherently creative, or they didn't.
Well, just distinguishing between the evaluative and the original. So I thought kids are original, but they have a very bad sense of audience. So they have
Or no sense of audience.
no sense. And so when one wants to teach creativity to kids, we often try to boost the originality, but what we really should attend to is sense of audience and the usefulness, if you will.
I wonder if that'll be limited in light of the development of prefrontal cortex not really coming online until later in life. So if we think that evaluation, and research is pretty strongly showing that evaluation, the higher order cognition that's involved in those kind of activities are not.
But we often think that children have other mind, theory of mind, and other mind. So the question is, in some ways, what can you do if it's sense of audience? What can you do to enhance a child's theory of mind?
So maybe not an executive perspective, but just a understanding of what you're putting out there and how other people are perceiving it.
In thinking about creativity from a developmental perspective, one ingredient that surely is lacking in small children is the executive component. But if you look at growth charts of brain networks, the default network is easily going to be of the large-scale networks, the one that is least integrated in children and the one that exhibits the maximum amount of differentiation between the ages of 6 and 21. The default network is bright red in terms of sprouting new connections and becoming more deeply integrated. So I'm curious to know if we think the default network has a set of functions X, Y, and Z. One way to kind of look at that is look at what is presumably a poorly integrated default network in children and see exactly what they're missing. I wonder if the quality of their mind wandering is substantially less sequential and serial and has a much more a wandering off quality rather than any genuine sort of spontaneous stream. But these are just speculations.
I think in search for simple heuristics, the field has settled too early on the idea that these networks aren't well in place at young ages. There's no question there's development. We know that there's myelination. Some of the between species studies have looked at actually the differences in things like dendritic arborizations between primary and secondary association cortex disease. These, a feature of humans and our close relatives development is that these association networks do develop late. The imaging literature has not spoken to this. There's too many confounds, but there is evidence. But I think that sometimes forgets that 7-year-olds do extraordinary cognitive things. They can imagine, they can think about yesterday, tomorrow. These networks are in place. Executive function is in place. The frontal lobe is there and functioning. That there's still a developmental window like our bodies develop is critically important, but I think it's sometimes overstated just how much is there at young ages. And given that, I guess worry is probably the right word. I worry, that we are building a society in which, forget about increasing creativity, just not stamping out what already exists, these threats, and thinking about that specifically.
I think from all of our the research on education, it's like play is what comes out as quite important. Not so much because they already do it, and in fact, the way Adele Diamond succeeds in getting them to show executive control is by having them play. So it's actually play is the thing that enhances their executive control. Of course, that's a matter of speech. It doesn't enhance it; it facilitates it, right? So it lowers the demands for executive control. So it makes me wonder. It's like instead of, I guess maybe that's what we're getting at. Instead of trying to train at children, like how do we actually structure our educational system as society to not stifle it, which I think is the main thing that we actually do, right? Both society through structure and the educational system by whatever it is that we do that kills that that tendency, right? And I think part of it is, I think the kids, maybe free time helps with that, is learning how to harness your own sense of play to enhance those things that you don't have, right? Like executive skills at that age or whatever it is that you don't have later on in life.
It seems to me it's not just the society that stifles it, but I think it must be brain, because what teenage is about is finding a mate and finding work, which means you need to sculpt out all sorts of stuff and conform.
That critical period of puberty, when there's, in terms of brain recruitment and brain maturation, the limbic system matures faster at a faster pace than the executive system. So you have this period centered around puberty when that exact thing happens. There might be different interventions that we should be planning on for different ages. But actually, I think for the early age, we need to be planning to not intervene. So we need to, that's kind of my understanding of where the evidence shows, right?
The skills that we ask children to acquire, writing and reading, are novel. They're inventions, very recent inventions. The world, only recently, I think, I don't know if it's right around 50% in terms of, I don't know what the exact numbers is, but it's only very recently that most humans would learn to read, even though reading and writing and scribes have been around for thousands of years. As the populace, we've not evolved to do this. It's co-opting visual processing system and language systems. And these are very, in that regard, they're very unnatural things.
1820, only 10% of the world's population can read and write.
Right.
In 1820.
1820. So these are not skills that are in our evolutionary, arena. And I'm not saying that these, obviously you learn to read to learn, and this is a critical gateway skill that has tremendous positive effect on society and on individuals. But the structure of a system that's asking children to sit down from very young ages to quickly acquire these unnatural skills is balanced against other kinds of time and other kinds of free play.
And it also brings up that component of threat and competition within, because we basically start in North America at 5-year-olds. You start teaching them to read and write, and basically by 7, pretty much all of them can read and write, 7 to 8, except for maybe a few people. But you created 2 years at which sort of random trajectories and the idiosyncrasies of your date of birth relative to the year when you started the school is going to create this emotional anxiety about how well I'm comparing to everybody else that's being taught this unnatural thing. And so I think the combination of that with the early, I guess, prevention from playtime is probably not having the best effects.
We talk about the question of sacred cows when we talk to all of our groups, and what is the one value that you hold up as a field as important above all other values? Is there one in neuroscience?
In thinking about this, and I even feel in our discussions, you see evidence of 2 different lineages that I think our field is so interesting because it draws in from an intellectual lineage that comes from systems neuroscience and also from psychology. And I think the sacred, goals and rules of those different disciplines are actually quite different. And they differ on a dimension that I think is important, just because of the discussion. And this is, I don't know if this is absolute, but a flavor of it is in some disciplines, there's more credit given for ideas and telling complete stories. And in other disciplines, there's tremendous penalties for overstating beyond what the data shows. I would say systems neuroscience, at least the culture that I'm aware of, puts a very high priority to knowing what you know and not overstating it.
I thought maybe I don't know if we are unique as a field, but it doesn't seem to me that we do have sacred cows. And if anything is sacred, it's the avoidance of sacred cows. That's how I feel. That might be peculiar to me, but I think I like to think that our field and maybe others as well just have and that carefulness not to overstate what you found while being aware of the need to tell stories, which we have, might be a way of actually implementing that avoidance of sacred cows, right? Although you might mean something completely different by that, right? Like, what are the common values that we subscribe to? I think that is one of the values, is that it's, you don't want to overcommit yourself to an idea, right? And make others overcommit.
My guess would be a common theme across scientific discovery would be truth, whether it's compensated for some boundary conditions where, for example, we've just seen the misuse of information historically, that you don't want to go there. But I think truth is probably, at some level, if it's not the most sacred, being accurate to your data, telling the world things that are not misrepresentations, is got to be up there for most scientific disciplines, I would think. But the question is there anything idiosyncratic here? And I liked your answer, that I think, especially amongst the group here, by definition, that you brought us in to talk about the default network and things like mind wandering, you're going to find a group that values not having boundaries, to say topics aren't taboo. And you even see it historically. Donald Hebb had a great quote, because he's somebody who's a neuroscientist, but also ventured into some of these areas of thinking about higher order function. He had a great quote in one of his papers, where the scientist who does not, and let me get the details right, the scientist who does not speculate is no scientist at all. Because I guess even then there was this tendency, when people would put ideas, if they didn't have the goods on them, to say, you can't say that. And his point is, of course I can say that, as long as I know it's the speculation. It's a hypothesis. Why shouldn't I? In fact, if we don't, as a community. And so it's just interesting that you see this tension also historically.